Welcome back to The Explainer. Today we're diving headfirst into one of the most classic, frankly mind-bending debates in the history of economics. We are looking at the legendary clash between A.C. Piogue and Ronald Coase over environmental regulation. If you've ever found yourself wondering exactly how society should handle the unintended, messy consequences of doing business, well, you're absolutely in the right place.
Let's kick things off with a question that seems pretty simple at first glance. If a factory pollutes a neighborhood, who is to blame? Your default assumption is probably the factory, right? I mean, it seems super obvious. The factory is the one pumping out the smoke, so the factory is clearly at fault. But as we're going to see today, economics has a really funny way of completely challenging our most basic, hardwired assumptions about fault, responsibility, and how we actually go about fixing complex problems.
Before we get into the weeds, let's quickly pin down the core problem we're dealing with here: externalities. An externality is basically what happens when one person's use of their own property imposes an incompatible, uncompensated effect on someone else. Think of that polluting factory harming the nearby households, or honestly, just a neighbor blasting heavy metal while you're trying to study. You're stuck paying the cost, whether that's bad health or a bad grade, for an activity you never actually agreed to participate in.
For a long time, the baseline fix for this came from early 20th century economist A.C. Piogue. Pigue's logic was pretty straightforward. Because a factory only really cares about its own private costs and totally ignores the social cost of the pollution it creates, it overproduces. His big solution? Tax it. A Pigouvian tax essentially forces the producer to internalize those negative externalities. By taxing the factory, the government artificially hikes up the costs until they match the true cost to society. This pushes the factory's output back down to a socially optimal level. And for decades, this was just accepted economic gospel. Got a bad externality? You slap a tax on it.
Fast forward to 1960, and Ronald Coase enters the chat with a radical paradigm shift. See, Piogue looked at harm as a one-way street, unilateral harm. Party A harms Party B, so obviously we have to restrain Party A. But Coase looked at that exact same scenario and saw bilateral harm. He argued that the harm is actually reciprocal. It takes two associating parties to even have a dispute in the first place. Think about it. Yes, the factory's smoke definitely harms the neighborhood, but forcing that factory to shut down or install massively expensive scrubbers inflicts a severe economic cost on the factory. Avoiding harm to B literally inflicts harm on A. This was a total intellectual plot twist. Let me read Coase's foundational quote on this because it's brilliant. We are dealing with a problem of a reciprocal nature. To avoid the harm to B would inflict harm on A. The real question that has to be decided is, should A be allowed to harm B, or should B be allowed to harm A? So the root of the problem, according to Coase, isn't just some bad guy doing bad things. The root of the problem is simply unclear property rights over an incompatible use of resources.
Okay, let's step out of the abstract theory and see how this actually plays out in the real world. Coase used a really famous agrarian case study as a proof of concept: the adjacent farmer and rancher. Imagine a rancher whose cattle occasionally wander over the property line to snack on the neighboring farmer's crops. Now, if either the farmer or the rancher simply wasn't there, we'd have no problem at all, right?
So, who's in the right? Well, under common law, you generally have two starting points. You could have an open range rule, which gives us ranchers' rights. The rancher lets the cattle roam completely free, and the farmer just has to deal with the damages or figure out how to protect themselves. On the flip side, under a closed-range rule, you have farmers' rights. Here, the rancher is strictly liable and has to pay up for any crop damage their herd causes. Piogue would tell you that the legal rule we choose here completely dictates the economic outcome. But Coase said, let's put some hard numbers to this. The rancher could build a fence around the herd for $400. The farmer could fence in the crops for $200. Or they could both do absolutely nothing and just accept $100 worth of crop damage.
The crucial, mind-blowing realization here is that doing nothing is actually the cheapest, most efficient solution for society. Under ranchers' rights, the farmer just absorbs the $100 hit. Under farmers' rights, the rancher writes a check for $100. Either way, nobody wastes money building expensive fences. The most efficient outcome happens regardless of what the law says.
But wait, what if the stakes jump and the expected crop damage spikes to $500? Suddenly, doing nothing is a terrible idea. It's the most expensive option. Under ranchers' rights, the farmer looks at a massive $500 loss, realizes building their own fence is only $200, and smartly decides to just build it. But what about under farmers' rights? The rancher is legally on the hook for $500. Being a rational business owner, instead of paying the $500 or even building their own $400 fence, the rancher just walks over and pays the farmer $200 to build the farmer's fence. No matter what the starting legal rule is, these two are going to negotiate the absolute cheapest solution.
This whole dynamic is what we now call the Coase theorem. The idea is that private parties can bargain voluntarily to reach an incredibly efficient outcome, without the government having to step in and tax anybody. But, and it's a huge but, this only works under some very strict conditions. The property rights have to be super well-defined, they have to be legally recognized and easily tradable, and most importantly, the transaction costs have to be low, which usually means you can only have a very small number of involved parties, like say one single farmer and one single rancher. This was the absolute core of Coase's groundbreaking 1960 paper, The Problem of Social Cost. His profound takeaway was that the initial allocation of property rights by the courts actually doesn't matter for market efficiency. The crops are going to be saved and the cheapest possible fence is going to be built, period. However, that legal starting point absolutely matters for the distribution of wealth. The crops are saved either way, but the law dictates exactly whose wallet gets lighter to make it happen.
Now for the reality check. Because like pretty much all elegant economic theories, there is a catch. And to his credit, Coase understood this better than anybody. We have to talk about transaction costs. The truth is, out in the real world, market bargaining is rarely free, and it is almost never simple.
What exactly is all this friction in the system? Well, first you've got search costs. If a massive factory is polluting the air, how do you even go about finding and organizing the thousands of affected residents? Then you've got bargaining and negotiation costs. Just try getting thousands of angry people and a giant corporation to agree on a price. It is a logistical nightmare. Next are information costs. We often have way less than perfect information about the true long-term health or environmental costs of that pollution. And finally, enforcement and compliance costs. Making sure everybody actually sticks to the deal takes lawyers, time, and money. If all these costs add up to be more than the value of the actual benefit, private bargaining just completely falls apart. And Coase never claimed we live in some magical zero transaction cost world. In fact, his point was kind of the exact opposite. Using his own words, the situation is quite different when market transactions are so costly as to make it difficult to change the arrangement of rights established by the law. In such cases, the courts directly influence economic activity. Basically, when transaction costs are too high, voluntary bargaining totally fails, and when it fails, the initial legal allocation of rights becomes the ultimate, final decider of who wins and who loses economically. So, let's bring all this into focus with our final section, Modern Regulatory Policy Takeaways, where we'll synthesize Piogue and Coase. How do we actually translate these historic theories into an actionable playbook for regulators today? Well, here's the synthesis. First, Piogue's tax approach is definitely a solid baseline tool, but it is not the only solution, and defaulting to it can sometimes be an unnecessary, heavy-handed move. Second, regulators really need to focus on defining property rights clearly. Clear rights are the foundation that actually enables private bargaining. Third, before jumping in, always assess the transaction costs.
If you're looking at a dispute with low transaction costs, like two neighbors arguing over a noisy generator, just let them negotiate. The law needs to step back. But if those transaction costs are sky high, like a major corporate polluter impacting an entire city grid, private bargaining is literally impossible. In those high-friction cases, the law and government regulation absolutely must step in to dictate efficiency.
Which leaves us with a pretty massive, lingering question to reflect on. In our hyper-complex modern world, one that is absolutely filled with high transaction costs, tangled global supply chains, and sprawling environmental impacts, we really have to ask, are the regulations we're designing today actually lowering the barriers to efficient bargaining? Or are we just using the government to build taller, far more expensive fences? Thank you so much for exploring this incredible economic debate with me on The Explainer. Keep learning, keep questioning, and we'll catch you next time.